All right, good morning, class, or actually good afternoon. I want to pick up, I didn't get quite as far as I wanted to in class in our sort of guided discussion that I was trying to use as a way to deliver what I thought were important terms and concepts from our early reading of Mahmoud Mamdani's book, Good Muslim, Bad Muslim. So I want to just revisit and pass through rather quickly some of the points that we already made. And the first topic we were talking about, what was Mamdani's, or what is Mamdani's primary argument in this book. And he really wants to try to drive a wedge between people thinking culturally about violence versus politically about violence. And sort of a short way to think about this is that for Mamdani, the proper motivation for violence is, not that there's a proper motivation for violence, but the proper way to think about what motivates violence is that it is almost always political and very rarely cultural in its origin. And yet, Mamdani is concerned that the way we are conditioned by either our political dialogues or the way in which media portrays events, we are almost always conditioned to think of violence in cultural terms. And so he wants to challenge his reader to be more critical about the message, critical in thinking about the messages that are sent to everyday people like ourselves about the nature of violence within our society. We spent a little time talking about the common perception within the West that violence is sometimes used for progressive purposes, meaning purposes that carry the world forward further into modernity, and therefore there's a suggestion that violence is either good or at least much more justifiable under those circumstances. And in that sense, in the West, we tend to think of violence as closely associated with war. You see this photo here of Baghdad in the early days of the U.S. invasion in 2003. And of course, the United States had been involved in Iraq in the 90s as well, and the first Operation Desert Storm. But moving on with Mamdani, he compares this in the West, this legitimate violence of war, compares it with the illegitimate violence that is oftentimes discussed by the West, that the use of terror is somehow explainable with cultural explanations, meaning that Muslims or the Islamic world is at its essence anti-modern. It has resisted this notion of modernity, and terror is a tool that allows the less modern or quote-unquote pre-modern Muslims in the Islamic world to carry out and balance their interests in challenging Western power through a violence of their own. And Mamdani is really just laying the foundation for explaining how he thinks that generally people think about violence. And his statement, of course, and you'll hear me repeat this, is for Mamdani, terror is a political act. It's not a cultural act. And so we will be wrestling with that as we go. We left off today talking about the late Cold War, and the real focal point of Mamdani's book is going to be focusing on this late Cold War, because he sees at this moment, particularly in American history, a dramatic shift in the foreign policy of the United States. And it's in this shift that happens after Vietnam and before the end of the Soviet Union in 1990, when the Soviet Union dissolves, where the U.S. carries out more of its violence, if you will, and more of its war, if you will, through what we can call proxy wars, having other people do the fighting for the United States. And Mamdani notices that this takes place at a time when the United States is no longer looking to simply contain communism, which is what it spent the first half of the Cold War doing, entering into places like Korea, giving support to Chinese nationalists during the Chinese Civil War, pushing back forcefully against Fidel Castro in Cuba after the Cuban Revolution, trying to contain in the Vietnam War, trying to contain a Southeast Asian country from quote unquote falling to communism. But by the time we get to the late 70s, and particularly when we get to the Reagan administration, starting in 1980 or 81, depending on how you want to define it, we start to see an actual effort to roll back communism, meaning not just to contain it and not let it spread any further, but to actually uproot it and eradicate it from the parts of the world that it has already established itself in. And the United States is going to use some I think we could say unsavory tactics, even by Western standards. The United States is going to start to venture beyond conventional warfare and even try some somewhat terror-like tactics on its own. You see these pictures here. One of the places we get involved is in Nicaragua by supporting the Contras, who are a group of people that the United States oftentimes refer to as freedom fighters, who are going up against a socialist dictator in Nicaragua. Similarly, in this lower picture, we support the Mujahideen, which were at first a political group that was trying to liberate Afghanistan from the Soviet invasion. The United States found common cause with the Mujahideen because even though we didn't agree with them and we didn't share much in common with them culturally, we had a common political objective, which was stopping the Soviet Union. And so, again, we see that political level here, and our interest in politics, shared political objectives, even allowed us to find common cause with this person, Osama bin Laden, who, as I mentioned in class, before he was against us and before we were against him, we were together fighting on the same side of the conflict in the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And as I mentioned, the U.S. will find itself engaged in some political terror, using terrorist tactics for the sake of accomplishing political objectives. Again, we would have explained these actions as war, as an effort to sort of legitimize them. But in many cases, they looked awfully similar to the same tactics that we ridicule when quote-unquote terrorists resort to them. Okay, so culture talk, I put up some images here, pardon me, that were just intended to get us to think a little bit about what we mean by the term Islamic culture. And I'll just kind of leave you at that. I think that picture in the upper left sort of really poetically sort of states what we're getting at. And a lot of the labels that are oftentimes lumped upon Muslims, particularly Muslim males, there's a lot of distrust and illegitimacy and suspicion. And in fairness, sometimes some very unspeakable horror and terror are carried out by Muslims. But the point here is, the central point that MAMDANI'S making is that the acts that we see and hear about in the news are not emerging from something cultural about Muslims. Almost without exception, we are seeing acts that are the political acts of Muslim people. And by that same comparison, oftentimes these acts are acts that are committed by different cultural groups around the globe. I think one of you mentioned in class today, movements like Irish nationalism and groups in Europe seeking to break free. There's nothing that is culturally Islamic about acts of terror, even though oftentimes the messages that we receive seem to indicate otherwise. Now, this is an interesting, I want to talk about how, culture talk, when it is joined to Muslims, it does something of a disservice, obviously to Muslims, but really to our critical thought throughout the world. For example, you oftentimes hear a phrase, Islamic terrorism, and we hear that so readily and so regularly that we almost fail to distinguish that there are two different things going on in that phrase. And it oftentimes challenges the consumer of that message, the audience of that message, to equate Islam and terrorism as being somehow one and the same. So that kind of culture talk, and culture talk in general, is limiting. But culture talk mixed with Muslims in particular challenges us to adopt certain assumptions, and for us to think that behaviors are culturally motivated as opposed to politically motivated. And it also, it's worth noting, it suggests that there is a monoculture, right? That all Muslims, I'm sorry I misspelled that, all Muslims conduct themselves in a very similar or a patterned way, and that of course isn't true. We've already mentioned that one of the ways that this becomes cultural is through references that Muslims are anti-modern, meaning they're standing in the way of progress and modernity, and their way of doing that is to use violence in the form of terror to make that happen. Now this image is an interesting one. What we're seeing here, this is a photo that regrettably took place in Abu Ghraib, which was a prison in Iraq. And it was a place where Muslims were being held. They would have been referred to as enemy combatants. These were people that in the War on Terror were apprehended and held for a time to determine whether or not they posed a risk or a threat to the coalition against that was involved, the Western coalition involved in this conflict. And unfortunately, this photograph was taken sort of as a recreational photo by some prison guards at Abu Ghraib, and it did tremendous damage to the U.S., the perception of the U.S. Efforts in its war on terror. And while this isn't physical violence, this is, oddly enough, this is a form of cultural violence. Modesty within Islam and Islamic culture is at the very heart of what it means to be a good Muslim. And so by taking a photo of naked Muslims who their heads are covered, they are not able to fend for themselves, they are doing this against their will, but yet this photo is shown as a form of cultural humiliation. There's something interesting going on here. The U.S. officials that are in charge of these enemy combatants are actually engaging on a cultural level. This is a cultural, in some ways, a culturally motivated injury being caused to these people, and it shows that it shows that as this kind of stands in contrast to this last comment of that violence is cultural, not political. That is something that MAMDANI wants to very much dismiss. He would argue that violence is not cultural, it is political, so the opposite of that. And this image is one that's particularly both poetic and painful in that regard. With that, I will stop, and I'll look forward to seeing you all tomorrow in class.